Welcome to Ouch. Was that a ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome back to Ouch Was That a Ghost with Liz. And thank you everybody for all your positive feedback you've been giving me lately. And I have been getting those messages about me doing too many collabs. So I will start trying to limit them to one a month. That doesn't include Mike and Katie, of course. And I am going to try to prioritize getting through all the requests I have, this being one of them. But I really do appreciate feedback, good, bad, other. Let me know. I'm still trying to figure it out. I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm not sure if by now you Patreons have gotten the little goodies that I've sent, but I really hope you enjoy them. So let's just jump right in. Spiritualism. It's a social religious belief that after we die, our spirit or awareness continues on and can be contacted by the living, whether directly or through a medium. Not to be confused with spirituality, which is more about an individual journey to find a sense of purpose. This is a story of how a preteen and a teenage girl are said to have started the spiritualism craze or religion that swept through the United States and Europe well into the 20th century. At its peak, it claimed over 8 million followers. It still exists today, but probably not to the extreme it was back then. So this starts in 1848 with the Methodist family, which consisted of John and Margaret Fox, who were farmers, the parents, along with their daughters, Catherine or Kate Fox, age 11, and Margaret, she went by Maggie Fox. She was 14. Two other children that didn't live with them, David, who was their older brother, he was away at college in Hydesville, and Leah was their older sister who lived in Rochester. The girls' parents just got back together after taking a break so their father could deal with his alcoholism, and the family had only moved into this humble one-bedroom house that they were renting in Hydesville, New York about a year prior. Already, the house was known as the neighborhood haunted house because one neighbor apparently saw a salesman go in and never came out. Even the girls started telling their parents that something strange was happening in the house. The parents just kind of brushing off the claims. A few months later, on March 31st, 1848, the girls who shared a room, it's a one-bedroom house, so I guess everyone shared a room. They went off to bed, and the parents started to hear noises coming from the daughter's room, the bedroom of the house. They heard knocking and tumbling sounds, and when the parents cracked the door to kind of peek their head in to see what's going on, the girls were still in a deep sleep, tucked into their beds. And the noise continued, and they were sort of startled awake. Mrs. Fox sent her husband to get a neighbor for help, thinking this is something demonic, which I don't know what a neighbor is going to do in that situation, but sure. So Mr. Fox came back with Mary Redfield, a neighbor. The shaken girls were just kind of sitting on the bed trying to process what was happening. The girls called out, "Count to 5." To everyone's surprise, they heard a response of 5 knocks. The girls then said, "Count to 15," and 15 knocks were heard back. "If you're an injured spirit, knock back 3 times," to the response of 3 knocks. Mary Redfield, the neighbor, was there bearing witness to all this. She was a very skeptical person. And the mother, just, I guess, testing the waters, asked the entity, "How old is Mary Redfield?" Everyone in attendance listening and counting the knocks, which totaled 33, which was exactly how old Mary was. Another neighbor, William Dusler, bore witness to the knocking as well. I've seen slight variations on who came and went, when, and in what order. I don't know, maybe she was inviting everybody over, looking for a logical explanation, or maybe just looking for confirmation that she wasn't losing her mind. The communication continued. One of the girls would snap her fingers and something would knock back, repeating the number of times. The girls called the knocking spirit in the house Mr. Splitfoot. And of course, this is gossip worthy, so news spread quickly. I mean, what else was happening at that time? In some articles, it said at least a dozen people were at the Fox's house the next day to try to communicate with the dead, while others say that it was in the hundreds. They wanted to witness this for themselves. Young girls that could communicate with the supernatural, this was a new concept to them. Of course, some people called the girls witches because that's what they do. whenever a woman does anything that's not explained. A nearby church even asked the family to stop coming. People would come by the house and ask the spirit questions, and the same thing, they would get knock replies. Some believed, and some were like, nah, this is all BS. For as many believers they had just as many people that criticized them and thought that they were making this all up. Over the next few days, the sisters developed a system. Knock 1 for yes, knock 3 for no, and the same with indicating letters. If they wanted to spell something out, you would have to wait like for C, knock, 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 C, or you know what I mean? That must suck if like a name has a lot of Z's in it. The unknown source communicated that he was a peddler named Charles B. Rosna, who was murdered over $500, and his remains were in fact buried in the basement. They wanted to dig up that night, but everything was flooded from the rain. So as soon as it was dry enough to do so, the basement was searched, and there was said to be a false wall that they found, and behind it, in fact, there were bone fragments and some hair. Rumors still flying around town. A lawyer named E. Lewis of Canandaigua went to go check this out, asking neighbors and the parents all about what was happening, and he ended up going on to publish a pamphlet titled A Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the House of John D. Fox. This pamphlet made its way to Leah in Rochester, the girl's older sister that I mentioned, and that's how she learned of what was going on. The mother was trying to protect her kids from whatever was happening in the house, so she ended up sending Kate to live with Leah, who was about 20 years older. She was 35 years old. Having been married, her name was Leah Fox Fish. Like I said, she lived in Rochester. She was a single mother, which back then must have sucked. Her husband was said to be an alcoholic that abandoned her and her daughter Lizzie. So for social reasons, she just told everyone that her husband died. And the way that she made it was that she gave piano lessons to support herself and her daughter. Mrs. Fox sent Maggie to stay with her brother David. But even at David's and at Leah's, the rapping noises were still happening, so it wasn't the house seemed to be following the girls around. Both girls ended up going to stay with Leah. While there, word of their abilities quickly spread. People would come by Leah's house and the girls would, free of charge, try to communicate with those on the other side. Some people that went to get readings by the girls were said to be touched. Knocking was heard. They would answer questions. Tables were even said to levitate and much more. As the word continued to spread, people started reaching out to have the girls perform private seances trying to communicate with specific people. Prominent community leaders, Isaac Post and Amy Post, who were grieving parents to a recently deceased daughter, invited the Fox sisters into their home in hopes of communicating with their departed daughter. And they, known skeptics as well, claimed to have witnessed, quote, very distinct thumps under the floor and several apparent answers, end quote. So now the girls had the support of the Posts, which just added more validity to the girls' abilities. So up until now, the girls didn't charge any money. People would leave tips as gratitude, but even with just the tips, Leah saw that this made way more than the piano lessons that she gave, so Leah was like, all right, I'm your manager. And as managers do, she booked the girls a gig, their first big gig. In 1849, Maggie and Kate, or as they were called now, the Fox sisters, did the first public display of spiritualism for paying customers. This was at the Corinthian Hall in Rochester, where they charged 25 cents a person to a crowd of nearly 400 people. In the crowd, this wasn't just people there to see the girls communicate with the other side. There were just as many skeptics in there trying to prove that this was all a hoax. I'm sure when the girls got up there, these young, pretty girls, that probably wasn't quite what the audience was expecting to see, but by the end of the show, the audience loved it. As the show ended, they burst into cheers. After the show, a committee was actually formed in order to try to disprove the girls. They would check their clothing looking for some sort of device. They were tested over and over trying to prove fraud. They placed them on glass. They placed them on pillows. And they would try all these different techniques trying to figure out what was going on, what was causing this. And on the third night of the show, the girls were brought into a room and they were actually disrobed and examined. These poor girls, they were just kids, but nothing was found. The girls were said to have been in tears, and it was stopped. The committee trying every method they could think of to expose them as frauds. On the fourth night, it was announced that they could not find any trickery. The skeptics in the audience didn't like this. They ended up setting off fireworks, just bursting into a riot. Law enforcement had to be called in to break it all up. By 1850, everybody knew their names, even Leah, because now she claimed she had abilities too. And the Fox sisters were just doing shows, doing private seances for those who could afford them. They were making a ton. They set up a tour. Some people astonished at the girls' ability, while some still skeptical. They performed at the Barnum Hotel in New York, where they booked a suite, and they had this huge round table where they would have about 30 people per session. They'd hold 3 sessions a day, and they'd hold private sessions in between. At the sessions with 30 people, they would charge $1 a person, which that's not too shabby, and charging, I'm sure, a lot more for the private shows. This was a time where women really didn't have the same job opportunities as men, so they were making bank. All the while, the media and people would mock them. The Scientific American called them, quote, the spiritual knockers from Rochester, while others were in awe of their ability. Leah ended up staying there in New York, where she married a banker who worked on Wall Street. Kate and Maggie ventured off onto their tour. They hit Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, Maggie met a man, Elijah Kent Kane, who tried unsuccessfully to prove that she was a fraud. When he couldn't prove she was a fraud, he decided to court her. I guess flirting was a little different back then. He wanted her to give up, quote, your life of dreary sameness and suspected deceit. Either way, the two fell in love, but there was a problem. Elijah saw what Maggie did as beneath him and his status, and he was a famous Arctic explorer. He had a trip to go on, and he made her a deal. As long as she stopped working in her field, he would propose when he got back from his trip. So she actually did. She left her sister at Kane's advice and went to school at his expense. Maggie now leaving Kate to tour alone, the bitterness started to grow between them. But Maggie's plan didn't quite turn out as she expected, as her to-be fiancé never came back, dying during his voyage in 1857. Maggie converted to Catholicism, and after the passing of her... See, I've seen this 2 ways. I've seen that she did get married and he passed away right after, but I've seen more of that he went on the trip and never got back and never got to marry her. Either way, Maggie turned to drinking to try and ease her pain, but she still needed to support herself, so she went back to working as a medium. Kate found a husband of her own, H.D. Jenkins, who was a barrister as well as a spiritualist. So the two started working together, making a ton during Civil War time. Because there's so much death, there's just a vast wave of grieving Americans, which were feeding this profession. So they had tons of work and they were just making bank. And spiritualism, you would think back then, would be shunned. But there were so many reputable and prominent people who were attending seances that it kind of gave it social acceptance, I guess. I mean, a lot of famous people, for instance, Thomas Edison, who created the phonograph, he had plans to make a spirit phone to speak with those beyond the veil. While on the other side, Mark Twain and Houdini were working just as hard to discredit it. Either way, everything was great until Kate's husband suddenly passed away from a stroke, leaving Kate a widow with 2 sons to raise. Kate, like her sister, turned to the bottle. Kate and Maggie were filled with bitterness and anger. This whole ordeal from childhood on went on for about 40 years, which started great for all involved. It was now a mess. The girls were just bickering and it was all going downhill. Kate and Maggie, like I said, still drinking a lot. Maggie thought Leah was taking too much money. Leah thought Kate drank too much and couldn't even take care of her kids. The Fox sisters' careers crashed on October 21st, 1888 at a show with Maggie on stage. Kate was in attendance, and Leah was nowhere in sight. It was a packed crowd with 2,000 people in attendance. Maggie, maybe because of anger towards her sisters, or maybe because of the $1,500 she was offered, who knows? She said, quote, my sister Katie and myself were very young when this horrible deception began. And she went on to describe perpetuating the fraud of spiritualism onto a too confiding public. And she told of how it all started when the sisters would tie an apple to a string and drop it on the floor, making sounds. She was sure to remind the crowd of how young she was when this started. The now over 50-year-old went on to explain how the girls then started practicing with their toes and demonstrated how the girls had mastered making a loud cracking noise, taking her shoe off and showing the crowd on a stool by cracking the first joint on your big toe by flexing a muscle in her leg, which sounded like a knock, and by practicing over and over, they could control the volume so it would sound like it's coming from different areas or louder, and that's what the girls did. They practiced until they were ready to see how far they could go with it. And she went on to describe how sometimes if you hear something, you can feel it even though nothing touches you, if that makes sense. Like if you think someone's going to touch you on your shoulder and your eyes are closed, you may feel something that's not there. She totally exposed Kate, claiming that she knew what was going on the whole time and was involved in the deception, and that even Leah knew as soon as they went to go stay with her. And she denounced spiritualism. The girls, Kate, remember, also in attendance, was there as the sisters just got booed and ridiculed. The spiritualist community tried to denounce the confession, saying that the Fox sisters drink too much, they made it up, they're just doing this to try to ruin Leah. Ultimately, the community just cut all ties with the girls. A year later, maybe because her funds dried up, or maybe the community pressuring her, Maggie tried to recant her confession. She was like, oh no, I just made that up. But the whole tour thing, the readings, nobody wanted that anymore from her. It was like done. The sisters never made up, all dying between 1890 and 1893. Kate died 2 years later at 56, Maggie died 8 months later at 59, and Leah died at 77, shortly after. All dying dirt poor. The bones of the supposed peddler that were found behind the false wall were said to have actually been there due to the false wall itself was said to be there due to like an expansion that they were doing on the foundation. And the bones themselves were said to be that of a chicken. Like, how do you make that mistake? But they, along with a peddler tin box, are said to be in the Lily Dale Museum to this day. Whether out of boredom or a prank that just went too far, the Fox sisters essentially started the spiritualism craze that took the world by storm. Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you need more content or just want to help support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com and search Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you need some snazzy merch, you can find it at crowdmade.com by searching Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you have a story you'd like to share, you can email it to ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com. You can also find us on Facebook and all the other social media platforms under Ouch, Was That a Ghost?
Help me.
All links can also be found on ouchwasthataghost.com.